Hey,
Hi
Hey,
guys, good
how's
to
it
see you.
going?
hey, it's been too long since we had a book club meeting like this.
Yep,
Uh,
I agree.
Now that we're all like teachers out in the world, we've been so busy. But Sydney, what have you been reading?
I was shopping on the online store for a good new book to read, and I found this awesome one called Rhythm and Resistance, Teaching Poetry for Social Justice.
OMG, I've been reading that exact same book.
You guys will not believe it, but I have also been reading.
You have not!
Hold the
What?
phone. Well, I'm just curious. Sydney, what do you think the main points and most powerful insights in this book are?
When I was looking for a new book to read, I thought it was going to be kind of dense and dry and full of really deep analysis about poetry. And I didn't realize it was going to be a super applicable book full of lesson plans that I can use in my future classroom.
I agree with you. I approached this book as someone who's pretty dissatisfied with the way that poetry is represented in the modern English classroom, especially when we're reading poetry. It seems like it's so distant. A lot of modern curriculum, there's no original poetry units whatsoever. Students can go all the way through high school without actually being asked to write a poem of their own. So I was really excited to discover this book.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tyler. I feel like sometimes poetry really it's become secondary to all of the material that we try to teach students, especially in an ELA classroom,
Mhm.
between teaching them to write essays and reading the classics, the canon, right? Sometimes poetry really gets shoved off to the side and students don't get a chance to engage with it and perhaps like really fall in love with it. And I think it's so valuable that we make sure that it is an important part of a larger curricula. And it gives students the chance to be creators, which I think some students that can be really powerful for them. Yeah, so Sydney, what do you think is like this book's overall argument or theme?
Um, You know, that's an interesting question. As I was reading through, I think there's quite a few themes that you can touch on, but one that I thought was really important was the value of personal experience. So the authors of this text really emphasized from day one that when your students walk into the classroom, you're creating a community. And I feel like they really show this because Linda Christensen, one of the authors of some of the lessons and the editor, she wrote an entire lesson about the name poem and states that her students do this exercise on their first or second day of class to really emphasize the fact that it's very important for students to learn one another's names and the fact that their background and personal experience is important and worthy of study in the classroom. So I wanted to read a little excerpt just from Linda's own name poem, but she writes that my name sounds like a country western singer, wrangling cows and cowboy hearts out on the range. Linda May is my intimate name, the name my family calls me when we're laughing, when there's blackberry pie on the table, and we spent the day swimming at Grizzly Creek or Swimmer's Delight. So you can really see here that, she's showing the kids when she reads this poem to them that her background and her name is important. And so the teacher is able to show that their students can reclaim parts of their identity that have been degraded by society through poetry and within the classroom. And students are really able to affirm their place in the world with these lessons. And so the book just really focuses on how much healing can happen through writing about the trauma that society has put a lot of kids through. And so it's just a really work that emphasizes that students can affirm their place in the world through poetry, and that is what poetry, social justice poetry, should be about. We construct a classroom where kids' lives are appreciated, and we're expecting different cultures and different backgrounds to show up in that writing.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic take on what the book offers. I wanted to also add, there's, to me, one of the best themes I found that I really want and looking forward to using in my class is mostly in chapter 3. That chapter, it's called Poetry for the People, But I thought it was a really cool series of lessons that really kind of orbited around the notion of teaching empathy and identity with this kind of poetry, but also coupling it with some really careful research before those kinds of empathy lessons were learned. Specifically, the authors said on page 99, just the intro to that section, they said, in a quote, "Our skin, our blood, and our bones sometimes understand events before our minds catch up and process the information. Writing poetry helps unleash sorrow or joy, the human understanding of loss and creation across cultures, centuries, and continents." I think that's a really great umbrella statement for what this chapter goes into. But my favorite part from this chapter was, they called it the Write That I poem. Strange name, but it's where students, they're challenged to write from the perspective of a fictional character or historical figure about how they would like to be remembered. But it provides an opportunity for students to grapple with questions of marginality, historical perspective, and how our ability to empathize with other individuals is impacted by forces both outside of ourselves and our own intentions. So I was just really fascinated by that idea. I'd love to use it in my class, especially if I'm teaching a book that people have a lot of preconceived ideas about, so that I can kind of push them to take a chance on a character or a certain subject position that they are less familiar with or that they think they know well. But what about you, Molly?
Yeah, man, I love everything that you guys are saying, and I agree. I feel like one of the themes I really saw come up again and again in this text was this idea that we can use poetry and our students can use poetry to talk back. So I think of when we talk about social justice, like a lot of those social justice issues require people to take an active role, right? An active role in dismantling systems and ideas. And I feel like this book is really positioning poetry as an action. It's engaging in that kind of work. And it's teaching students that they're not just passive recipients of systems that seek to degrade them or silence them, right? They're not passive recipients of violence, of racism, of a school to prison pipeline. They are empowered to use their own voices and their own experiences as a way of telling society, I see these injustices happening all around me and I have something to say about it. So, I mean, one example that I think of was the chapter on praise poetry. In that lesson plan, the teacher had her students read Lucille Clifton's poem, My Hips. And I have a little excerpt. It goes, "Big hips, they need space to move around in. They don't fit into little petty places. These hips are free hips." So like here, Clifton is essentially talking back to these dominant European American standards of beauty and culture. She's praising her body and she's owning this feature that other people have sought to degrade or say is abnormal or not right or not beautiful. And she's doing it through poetry. She's talking back. So I felt like through all these lessons, there was this theme of like enabling students to call out inequities, injustices, and to respond with their own voices.
Well, Molly, some of the points you're making are actually reminding me of, do you remember that class we took in grad school with Jerry Rozek?
Yeah, Educational Studies 630, right?
Yeah. But yeah, that's really kicking up something in my memory. Can you think of any connections between this and the text we read in that class?
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that because, you know, when I was reading this book, I was thinking a lot about Common Core and how this book and teaching poetry specifically could fit in with the Common Core standards, especially the standards around reading and writing. And kind of one of the things I was thinking about, you know, there are very few guidelines about how poetry could or should fit into ELA standards. Like, in fact, there's very little mention of poetry at all. You know, some of those standards are so vague that I feel like that could be a benefit in the sense that teachers could take a standard like this one, produce clear and coherent writing in which the development, organization, and style are appropriate to task, purpose, and audience. They could take a standard like that and use poetry to meet that standard. So in some ways, Common Core is flexible and vague enough that teachers could teach poetry to meet some standards. However, the problem that I was thinking about actually was in some of those readings that we read for that educational studies class. It mentioned that Common Core is really focused on evidence-based argumentative writing and informational texts. So Common Core is really concerned with content, right? So Common Core seems to be arguing really that nonfiction and informational text are going to provide that college and career readiness that the standards are very concerned with. So the problem that I see with that is that it could really place pressure on teachers to really only touch on poetry, that it would become supplemental, right, and secondary to all of that informational reading and writing. I mean, Common Core seems to reinforce this idea that poetry is not as important as those other things. One of those articles that we read back in that class, it was talking about how students before Common Core spent way too much time on personal voice, personal writing, and that they were, quote, ill-equipped for demands of more scholarly writing once they arrive on campus, much less for the kind of professional writing demanded by the real world. Now, this book, Rhythm and Resistance, seemed to totally reject that idea. The authors say that they encourage resistance to the narrowing of curriculum to serve the job market or college. They're saying that should not be the focus of teaching for any content, but specifically for poetry. I think Linda Christensen, she goes on to say that the real world is where hunger and poverty exist, where governments wage wars for profit, and that an education in preparation for the real world must teach empathy, must call attention to policies and actions that harm society's most vulnerable. So for me, that was a pretty strong argument that poetry should not be overlooked. It is every bit as important as other reading and writing practices to prepare students for the real world.
What about you, Sydney? Did you connect our reading to anything in Jerry's class back in the day?
Yeah, thinking back on it, the lessons in this book really remind me of the same messages that Bettina Love is talking about, both in the interviews and the article that we got to read about her and her work. And so just the title of her book, we want to do more than survive. That really is hit on in these lesson plans. It's teaching that we don't want our students to just survive by writing, as Molly has pointed out, these structural informational essays. We want our students to thrive. We want them to love reading and writing. We want them to love poetry and really connect with what they're working on. And so, another main theme that Bettina Love really highlights is just the idea of joy and bringing joy into the classroom. And, how disappointing would it be to teach entire lessons towards a test, and then students, may pass that test but hate writing and hate reading. There's no joy in that. That's not what we want as teachers, to train individuals who don't like the art of expressing themselves. And so, the book just really talks about that all students are really worthy of creativity and beauty. And Bettina Love really gets at that, especially when talking about Black students in our classroom and valuing their ability to express themselves creatively, and that they have the capability of producing things that are beautiful and joyful, and that if we can't recognize that as teachers, then we don't deserve to be teaching them. And so I think that this book really highlights and equips future teachers and current teachers to continue to talk back to oppression, both outside of the classroom, but within the classroom and school system as well. And some of that oppression that's felt is the continued standards of, we just need to focus on the bare minimum. There shouldn't be joy in this classroom. There shouldn't be self-expression.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Tyler?
Well, those are some fantastic connections that you two both made. And then I think this book really does have a lot to offer. But for me, my mind immediately went to dusting off our old copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed here by Paulo Freire. So for me, the chapter I was really focusing on, its message on identity and empathy made a connection with me to the kinds of consciousness that Frere envisioned in his book. Specifically in chapter 2, Frere writes, in problem-posing education, people develop their power to perceive critically the way they exist in the world with which and in which they find themselves. They come to see the world not as a static reality, but as a reality in process, in transformation. So that was on page 56 of this printing, if you want to go read it. But that quote really resonated with what I think Christensen and Watson are trying to do here, but I'll explain with an example. One of the things that I think really gets at Frere's idea of consciousness are, there are a few lesson plans that center on dialogue poems. One here is structured to interweave the voices of two subjects in the same historical or literary moment to highlight the stark and the subtle manifestations of inequality. But there's another one, the next lesson right after that I found really interesting. But in that one, they specifically were asked to speak directly back to the stereotypes that they faced as individuals. So instead of a dialogue poem with two students talking to each other, it was a moment for these students to speak together outwardly, to reinforce one another in these alternating lines of praise and pride in their identities. So they're kind of supporting one another as they spoke out at the way the world had made them feel. So both of these structures are, in my opinion, a really great starting point for teachers who want to decenter the way that poetry instruction has participated in the banking model, and really invest their time and energy into fostering consciousness and confidence in their students' voices and identities and communities.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'm really curious. It's hard for everyone to just read an entire book. What do you all think are some parts of this book that if someone has a quick moment, they should read? Yeah, Molly, what do you think?
Yeah, I like that question, Sydney. I think for other teachers, I would really recommend that first chapter. It's titled Roots Where We're From. And it includes some poems we've talked about, like the naming poem, a poem, Where I'm From poem. I feel like that could be really useful for teachers across all content areas, especially in the beginning of the year. If they're looking for activities to kind of build community, get students talking, get them to share something about themselves that maybe feels low stakes, but maybe also builds a little bit of trust between students. And as the author pointed out, community building should happen throughout the year. So someone could easily draw upon one of these early Where I'm From poems or name poems anytime throughout the year to really get back to that community. What do you think, Tyler?
Yeah, I agree. Something I didn't mention before is the last chapter is really different from the rest of them because it kind of focuses on the nuts and bolts of teaching poetry as a creative process. So it has a lot of description activities, poem writing an image, verb-focused poetry, that kind of thing. But I think it's a really good starting place if you're really looking to build those foundational skills for original poetry, and also just has some more cool ideas about how useful poetry can be in ways that we wouldn't normally think of, like actually using poetry in assessment to ask your students to write a poem to explain to me your understanding of this chapter. It's kind of outside of the box, and I thought an interesting opportunity. But yeah, Sydney, what do you think? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I agree with both of you all. And I actually just really felt like there is so much wisdom throughout the entire book, and that you can really, and I will personally just keep this book on my bookshelf. And anytime I want some help or advice in writing a poetry lesson or talking about poetry with my students, especially keeping social justice in mind, that I can go and I could probably flip open to any page in this book and really find useful lesson planning and tips about how we interact with our students and what position we take in the classroom as a teacher, in valuing our students, in creating that community like Molly, mentioned. Yeah, so I think all of it.
I gotta agree with you.
Me too.
So I really appreciated this discussion, you guys. It helped me to really think about how we could use this in our classrooms. But ever since President Ocasio-Cortez passed the most recent funding bill for arts and humanities and public education, I've just been lesson writing like nobody's business. So I got to go get back to that. But I'll see you again same time next month.
Yeah.
Good.
Sounds good.